From Deloitte Tax, welcome to the Tax News and Views podcast. In this podcast series, we talk to specialists from Deloitte about the latest business issues and developments. I'm Carrie Falkenhayn, your host for Tax News and Views. Today's topic is going to be on property taxes, including the impact of the current environment, which, as we know, includes rising interest rates, and the impact on both real and personal property taxes. Joining me today are two Deloitte property tax specialists, Debbie Lasel and Evan Staggs. And Evan, I think I'll start with you and talk about real property. And maybe you could share with us how the current environment of higher interest rates might affect real property assessments moving forward.
Hi, Carrie. Thanks for having me. Yeah, this is a very different environment than a lot of real estate developers and operators are used to being in for the last 10 years. And, in the current era of higher inflation that we're all experiencing and the higher interest rates that come with them, a lot of the assumptions that many taxing jurisdictions throughout the country used to operate on have sort of gone out the window. And a lot of those assumptions that they operate on now work against taxpayers. So, if you go to a lot of real estate developers, they used to, maybe from 2000 to 2010 or 2015, they used to just assume their incomes would increase by around 3 to 5%, which are fairly standard budgeting assumptions. But with inflation going up to 7%, if your operating incomes don't match that, now your properties are going to be worth less. And so many jurisdictions have always assumed low inflation, low interest rates, and increasing values. But obviously now, if you talk to a real estate developer, they're going to tell you that their properties are simply worth less because inflation is so high and interest rates have gone up with them. So there's this sort of push and pull between taxing jurisdictions and taxpayers to say, this is how much properties are worth, and that needs to reflect the current environment that we're in.
I got it. And I imagine there's a lot of properties that are being refinanced right now. How does the appraisal you get with that refinancing affect either the taxable value of your property or your ability to achieve reductions going forward?
Sure. So, obviously there are going to be a lot of situations, CFOs or any finance department, dealing with real estate and loans they have against those properties. A lot of these loans were extended during COVID. A lot of the loans that were coming up for refinancing at that period were simply extended for 12 to 18 months. And now a lot of those properties are going to enter into a formal refinancing period. And in those instances, oftentimes appraisals are done. The downside of that is if you think your property is overvalued, which, as we discussed, is likely the case with higher inflation, those appraisals will be one of the first things these taxing jurisdictions ask for. And a lot of these, government agencies will subscribe to services that will tell them what the details of those loans are and what the underlying value assumption is. Oftentimes, those appraisals are very different than what we would like to see in a property tax appraisal. They include prospective income, pro forma income, things like if we built a hotel on this land, how much would it be worth? And they factor that into the value because oftentimes there's an implicit goal of pulling money out of the property. So you want that value to be as high as possible. Whereas our job is to just accurately say, this is what the property is worth on the lien date. There are really divergent goals in each kind of valuation. I would say specialists in the area know how to make that argument. But it's definitely something you want to be aware of, that if you have properties that you're trying to refinance with a lender, or you're trying to enter into a new financing agreement with a lender, any kind of appraisal that's out there is going to be asked for by the taxing jurisdiction. And I think an explanation should be ready when that happens.
So it sounds like before you finalize that appraisal, check with your property tax advisor.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. So we keep hearing about a looming recession. It seems like there's good news or bad news every other day. What does a recession mean to property tax bills? I guess everyone would assume they'd be lower. Is that right?
Yeah. I think that's what we'd all like. Certainly, when COVID hit initially, there were certain industries, I know retail, hotels specifically, where there was this automatic assumption by asset management groups and finance groups, okay, well, there's no way they're going to collect property tax bills. There's no way that they're going to jack up values. And in many jurisdictions, they did. There are some places like New York City where they very, in a very high profile way told everybody that they were lowering assessments. But, the way that these things actually work out, a lot of tax bills ended up being slightly higher, even though a lot of these hotels were closed and a lot of these office buildings and malls were closed. So now I think we're looking at what I would consider to be a more, I guess, traditional recession. It's not overly severe like something we might have seen in 2009, but it's also a very specific recession. And so when we talk about, retail as an industry that has seen its fair share of transition over the last 8 years, I wouldn't say that's really specific to this cycle. But I think you're definitely looking at office properties right now where there's a lot of questioning about what these properties look like going forward. I think a lot of tenants, especially in central business district type areas, are reconsidering how much real estate they need and what the real estate footprint should look like, over the next 5 to 10 years. And so, I've heard from office developers who are saying, what does it look like to convert an office building into residential or condos or a hotel or something like that? And oftentimes right now, if you have an office building that's below what you think traditional occupancy could be, you should expect a lower property tax bill. If you have a hotel that isn't operating what you think it should be at or what the market is at, you should have a lower property tax bill. These are signs of a recession that should result in a lower bill. That being said, taxing jurisdictions always have their preferred methods for valuing a property. And unsurprisingly, it often results in higher assessments when it counters what you think. And so developers, people who operate in the real estate industry are always in the best position to know how much their properties are worth. And so I think it really takes a really good specialist to sort of connect the dots and say, hey, this is what my client is telling me, and this is what the taxing jurisdiction is saying, and how do we get an equitable outcome here that reflects the current economic environment?
And just given the variability in economic performance by industry, it's no doubt that we're going to see a lot of those instances, I would think.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, thank you for that, Evan. Debbie, maybe we talk a little bit about business personal property. I know with supply chain disruptions, many organizations have had to go through different channels to procure equipment and supplies, oftentimes paying a premium over what they would expect to normally pay. How do those premiums affect the personal property assessments?
Sure. Hi, Carrie. Thanks for having me. The simple answer is that unfortunately the premiums will be reflected in your personal property assessment just by virtue of the methodology that assessing jurisdictions use to value and assess personal property. They typically take the original costs of the property as a starting point and apply their own depreciation schedules to determine some measure of market value of the property. So if a taxpayer purchased a piece of equipment for $12,000 that they might normally purchase for $10,000, that equipment would be capitalized on their books at $12,000. And in the typical case, when the taxpayer reports their business personal property to the jurisdiction, the cost that they would report for that equipment would be $12,000. And the jurisdiction would apply its depreciation schedule to the $12,000 cost. So that premium would be reflected in the personal property assessment because the higher price would be the starting point for determining the assessed value.
Got it. So is there any way around that so that you could exclude the premium?
Yes, and this is an answer with slightly better news for the taxpayer. And one thing to bear in mind conceptually with property tax versus other tax areas is that in income tax, for example, if you make less money, you'll pay less in taxes. Or with sales tax, if you make fewer sales, you'll collect a lower amount of sales tax. But with property tax, assessing jurisdictions have to use mass appraisal techniques to value a high volume of personal property. So it ends up being a little more incumbent upon the taxpayer to make the assessing jurisdictions aware of circumstances that might impact the value of their personal property. So in the example where there's a supply chain disruption and you're paying a premium over what you pay your normal vendors, I mean, it's the same equipment that someone might typically purchase, but there's just a temporary markup due to shortages. And depending on the jurisdictions where the taxpayer is located, there could be an opportunity to request an adjustment for economic obsolescence. And economic obsolescence is basically an impairment in value due to external factors. And assessors ultimately want to achieve a measure of market value in their assessments. So as a simple example, think about two people buying the exact same car, exact same features, but one person pays the sticker price and one person gets a discount off the sticker price. I mean, is one of those cars more valuable than the other just because one person paid more? I mean, they're basically the same thing. They're fungible. And market value is in part a function of the principle of substitution. No buyer would pay more for a piece of equipment than the price of a substitute that would have equal capability and function. So a taxpayer who's paying that scarcity premium would have a reasonable argument that they could make with the jurisdiction that the supply chain issues are temporary and that the scarcity premium is temporary, and that looking forward, there's no subsequent buyer that would pay that scarcity premium if equipment of similar function was available without that scarcity premium. So I think there is an argument for taxpayers to make to the jurisdiction if they're finding themselves in those situations where they've had scarcity premiums or other excessive costs due to supply chain issues.
And your example around cars is a good one, right? We've seen a lot of changes in the price of cars as they became more scarce and now going the other direction as they become less scarce. So that makes sense to me. Are there other ways that inflation could impact the assessment of personal property?
Yes, I would say another way that inflation could come into the assessment of personal property is for jurisdictions that use trend factors or price indexes when valuing personal property. And that typically happens with replacement costs and reproduction cost approaches. And again, the ultimate goal is to reach some measure of market value as of the assessment date. But sometimes a price index can capture an inflationary period. This can happen with some of the price indexes that are used for utility property or for telecommunications property. Sometimes those indexes can be a little more commodity price driven. So if there's a spike in the price of an input for those indexes in particular, or really any price index in general, if there's an increase in the price of the basket of goods that underlies the price index, that would filter through in the calculation of market value and the assessed value of the property. Particularly with reproduction cost approaches, there's always an opportunity for a taxpayer to ask the jurisdiction to consider adjustments for economic and functional obsolescence. Economic obsolescence being more germane to this discussion because that's the type of obsolescence that results from external factors like shortages or supply chain issues.
So it sounds like understanding the methodology used by a jurisdiction and which arguments to make will be important in looking at whether or not the assessment that you receive as a taxpayer is appropriate or not.
Yes, I would say that's exactly right. And that's always good advice for the taxpayer to understand the jurisdiction's methodology and to work within that methodological framework to find an adjustment that benefits the taxpayer, but that also fits the jurisdiction's methodology.
Got it. All right. Well, thank you both, Debbie and Evan, for that update. I'm sure you've given our audience lots to think about as they start to get their property tax assessments. If anybody would like more information, you can do a couple things. You can go on Deloitte.com and search property tax, and there's lots of information there about our services. You can also connect with Debbie and Evan directly via LinkedIn. And of course, please stay tuned here for our next Tax News and Views podcast. In the meantime, thank you all for joining us and listening in. And I hope everyone continues to be well. Take care, everyone.